If the world economy collapsed overnight, it wouldn't start with chaos in the streets. It would start with silence, no notifications, no transactions, no approvals, no payment successful, just frozen systems, empty screens, and millions of people suddenly realizing that everything they trusted to hold value doesn't anymore. Banks wouldn't open, markets wouldn't move, salaries wouldn't arrive. And the scariest part, you wouldn't feel like a disaster at first, it would feel like confusion, because the modern world is built on one fragile illusion that tomorrow will always behave like today. But what happens when tomorrow refuses to show up the same way? When money becomes meaningless paper, when digital systems shut down, when supply chains break like glass under pressure? This isn't just an economic question. It's a question about survival, trust, and the invisible systems holding civilization together. And once they stop, we don't just lose wealth. We lose identity. We lose order. We lose certainty. The question is not whether it can happen. The question is what happens to you when it does. The day money forgets its value begins with a quiet shift in men's minds long before the world notices the markets are broken. For many men, money is not just currency, it is identity, protection, and proof of worth. When that foundation starts to crack, psychological pressure rises faster than the economy itself. A man who once measured success by provision suddenly questions his role when provision loses meaning. From a woman's perspective, the same collapses experienced differently. Security is no longer assumed. And trust and stability becomes a constant internal calculation. Relationships begin to feel the strain not from emotion, but from uncertainty about survival itself. What was once predictable becomes negotiable, and emotional decisions start competing with raw practicality. When the system stops recognizing value, survival instincts begin to override everything else. In ways most people never anticipate. Men who are conditioned to provide shift into problem-solving mode under pressure, often suppressing fear to maintain control, while women often recalibrate faster toward resource awareness and social support mapping, reading instability through emotional and environmental cues. In this breakdown of meaning, human behavior becomes less about status and more about immediate adaptability, exposing how fragile modern certainty really. When systems stop asking permission and start collapsing, the first thing that breaks are not infrastructure, it is trust. Men who are often conditioned to rely on systems as extensions of their responsibility feel an immediate psychological shock when control disappears. The instinct is not panic at first, but denial, followed by a rapid internal shift into problem-solving mode. A man begins asking, what can I fix? What can I protect? What can I still control? But when every system from banking to communication fails, at once, even control itself becomes an illusion. From a woman's perspective, the collapse is processed differently. The focus moves quickly towards safety networks, relationships, and environmental signals. Where men try to rebuild order internally, women often read the external world for patterns of danger and support, prioritizing stability through connection rather than control. When permission-based systems vanish, society briefly reveals its raw state. No approvals, no digital confirmations, no institutional validation. Just human behavior exposed under pressure. Men who tied their identity to functionality feel stripped of purpose, while women sense the emotional ripple through families and communities faster than official information can spread. In that moment, authority is no longer granted by systems, but redefined by presence, adaptability, and psychological resilience. Under uncertainty, the illusion of global stability breaks in seconds when people realize that what felt permanent was only coordinated behavior held together by trust. For men, this moment hits the identity center first. Many are raised to believe stability is something they build and protect. So when it collapses without warning, the immediate reaction is responsibility without direction. The mind searches for structured jobs, systems, roles but finds none that respond. This creates a silent psychological conflict where purpose remains active, but the environment no longer supports it. From a woman's perspective, the break is often felt as a shift in safety and predictability. Attention moves toward people, not systems, because survival feels more relational than structural. The emotional scanning intensifies who is calm, who is reacting, who can be trusted when institutions cannot be. The speed of collapse matters more than the collapse itself because the brain does not have time to negotiate meaning. Men tend to internalize pressure, suppressing visible fear to maintain leadership even. In confusion, while women often become rapid interpreters of social and emotional cues to maintain cohesion within immediate groups. In that split second where global certainty disappears, both perspectives reveal something deeper about human psychology under dependency on invisible systems. When nothing works anymore, people do not suddenly become rational, they become instinctive. Men, who are often conditioned to be problem solvers, initially double down on control. They try systems that no longer respond, repeat actions that no longer produce outcomes, and quietly absorb the frustration so others do not see the breakdown happening internally. Beneath that silence is not confidence, but a deep recalibration of identity, because for many men, usefulness has always been tied to worth. When usefulness disappears, the mind searches for a new definition of purpose in real time. When normal structures fail, women often shift faster into relational intelligence. The focus moves away from systems and toward people who is safe, who is panicking, who can be stabilized through communication and presence. Instead of trying to fix the broken mechanism, there is an instinct to preserve emotional continuity in the group because survival begins to feel social rather than mechanical. When repeated effort produces no result, both perspectives converge into a shared psychological state, uncertainty without instruction. Men begin to loosen their attachment to control, and women become more selective about emotional energy distribution, reading risk through behavior rather than information. In that space, human nature reveals itself without the comfort of functioning systems guiding every decision. When everything else disappears, the real currency that survives any economic disaster is not money, it is trust. For men, this truth cuts deep because much of identity is built around providing value through external systems that suddenly no longer respond. When the systems fail, men are forced to confront a different measure of worth-com presence, adaptability, and the ability to protect others without instructions. From a woman's perspective, trust becomes the invisible infrastructure that determines safety, direction, and emotional stability when formal structures collapse. When disaster removes money from its throne, behavior becomes the only currency that still has value. In those moments, men tend to communicate leadership through action rather than words, suppressing fear to maintain stability for those around them. Women, on the other hand, often become the emotional signal processors of the environment, reading shifts in tone, behavior, and risk faster than systems can explain. This is where survival stops being about resources and starts becoming about interpretation of human behavior under pressure. In the silence after collapse, what remains valuable is not ownership but reliability under uncertainty. Men begin to realize that strength is no longer measured by control over systems, but by steadiness when systems fail completely. And women increasingly recognize that the strongest networks are not financial or digital, but human connections that hold under emotional strain, because in that state, value quietly shifts into presence, consistency, and the ability to remain grounded while everything around is uncertain. When the world stops paying attention, identity is no longer reinforced by applause, validation, or recognition, and that silence forces a deeper question about who you are without witnesses. For men, this moment often feels like a collapse of external purpose because so much of male psychology is shaped around being seen as useful, needed, and reliable. When that external confirmation disappears, the mind turns inward and begins reconstructing meaning from scratch. Some men initially feel invisible, not because they are less valuable, but because the feedback loop that once defined them has shut down. From a woman's perspective, the absence of attention from the world often shifts focus away from performance and toward emotional grounding, relationships, and survival clarity. Without external noise, perception becomes sharper and priorities become more instinctive than structured. When recognition fades, what remains is not reputation but character under pressure. Men who once measured themselves through achievement are forced to confront how they behave when no one is watching, and whether discipline still exists without reward. This is where many discover either fragility or depth they never had to test before. Women, in the same silence, often recalibrate social awareness differently, focusing less on external validation cycles and more on emotional consistency within close environments, reading trust through behavior rather than status. When attention disappears completely, both men and women are stripped of borrowed identity and left with raw presence. Men begin to understand that strength. Love is no longer about being seen, but about remaining steady when unseen. Women begin to recognize that influence is not volume or visibility, but emotional stability that others unconsciously rely on. In that quiet absence of the world's gaze, people stop performing versions of themselves and start confronting who they actually are when nothing is being recorded, rewarded, or remembered externally.